Okay, so week one of college football finally here, and I'm joined with a special guest today, Spencer McLaughlin. Spencer, you're kind of the resident expert of all things ducks around the Oregon, as we said before we started recording, program. So before we get started, I want to let the people know where they can find you at because hopefully this is a collab that will happen again in the future, especially as Dan Lanning's career takes off in Eugene. So where can the people find you?
At Smalls_55 on Twitter, and I host the Locked On Ducks podcast, which is available on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I also host Locked On Pac-12 commentary on our beloved Conference of Champions, however long it continues to exist into the future. God only knows how long that will be. But that's also available on YouTube or wherever you listen to the show. But yeah, it's great to be on with you, Ty, and always down to talk some Ducks. And I like the sound of resident expert on the Oregon Ducks because it's way too generous. But you know what? I'll take it at this point.
Hey, I'm a generous man. What can I say? But you started it off. You do some work with the Pac-12, and that's kind of where I want to start this because the Pac-12 to me right now is super intriguing. Dan Lanning comes in. You have Lincoln Riley coming in, not to mention a coach that's been there like Kyle Whittingham. So, what are you expecting for the Pac-12 this year? There's just so much intrigue around the league.
Yeah, it's tough to get people to remember that they're about to play two more football seasons with the 12 teams that are currently there. And I understand that, people are generally more interested, at least when I track the views and downloads on my shows, they're more interested in conference realignment talk, which I think is kind of too bad. That's fascinating conversation. We could probably go for, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 12 hours on conference realignment. We could go as long as we wanted to and whatnot. But when you look at the Pac-12 this year, there are compelling stories everywhere you look. I do not just say that because I host a show about it. And, some teams are definitely more interesting than others, like Colorado this year. I don't think they're going to be that fascinating. But, Washington State is an interesting one. Washington, again, I don't think super fascinating because they're in a little bit of a transitionary phase. Cal, not so much. Stanford, a little bit. But you look around the rest of the conference, you got Lincoln Riley at USC. How quickly is he going to be able to come in and just dominate the way people think he could in a couple of years? He'll only have 2 seasons in the Pac-12, but is he going to win a Pac-12 championship before USC departs, right? How quick is that turnaround going to be? And a lot of people have high hopes for him, and I think they rightfully should. He recruited a high level at Oklahoma, and he's, of course, an elite in-game manager when it comes to play calling and being a quarterback whisperer for guys like Baker Mayfield, Kyler Murray, Jalen Hurts, and now Caleb Williams as well. The only one that didn't work out in there is Spencer Rattler, but hey, nobody's perfect. But it's an interesting area to look at in the Pac-12 because they were 4-8 last year. They fired their coach early in the season. Team kind of gave up. Now they've revamped big time in the transfer portal. I think they're a great test case for how quickly you can turn your football program around using solely the transfer portal, right? Not how quickly you can, or not how much you can build in a given year. I think the better example of that potentially is UCLA, who is not recruiting at a high level, but they're hitting the transfer portal at a high level. USC is really going to be, I think, the premier test case with this new one-time freebie transfer rule of how quickly can you turn your team around. And there are different standards at every program across the country, but they were a 4-win team last year. And the only major brand I can think of that fell down like that and was turned around in one season was Michigan with Jim Harbaugh. And that was pre-transfer portal with the one-time exemption rule. So I'm really interested to see if he can do that because it's a hard thing to do. And most people, I don't think, fully understand and appreciate how hard it is to turn any program around, even a high level one, right? Is it easier than at some other places? Of course. But does that make it easy? No. Nick Saban didn't turn Alabama around right away. And yes, prior to his arrival, they were a blue blood with Bear Bryant, right? Who prior to Nick Saban was probably considered the greatest coach in the history of college football. You'd maybe have Newt Rockne at Notre Dame if you want to go way back. At Woody Hayes at Ohio State, he'd be in the conversation as well. But Alabama was a blue blood that fell down, and it took Saban a couple years, right? And so now the ultimate test of how impactful the transfer portal really is, I think, exists at USC because they've brought in an absurd amount of talent via the portal. It's primarily at skill positions, but They have the reigning Bolitnikoff winner. They've got a future first-round NFL quarterback. They've brought in a bunch of other players from the Pac-12 and beyond who are really talented. So USC is really interesting there. Utah, whether or not they can get to the college football playoff, they're going to be a great watch this year, starting this weekend when they go down to Gainesville, take on Florida in the Swamp. But then even the programs that are not expected to win a high level, right? Oregon State, year 5 under Jonathan Smith. Is he going to deliver in a season where they have more expectations than they have in the last couple of years? Arizona with Jedd Fisch has got San Diego State this weekend. If he wins that game, do we completely flip our view of the Wildcats? How long is that turnaround going to take? Certainly more than 1 year since he's been there for one season, and they were 1-11 last year. So, and I could go on and on. There's a lot to watch for in the Pac-12. And you know, on my show, I've kind of cooled down on the conference realignment talk until there's more major news on that front. There's just a lot to get to this season, and I can't wait.
Yeah, the conference realignment talk, that's super intriguing, but it's so theoretical at this point because it seems like there are so many possibilities. And until some things are more set in stone, it's kind of just throwing an opinion out there on what could happen. And at this point, I'm with you. There's so many pressing matters to get to. I really like the point you make about USC and how it could take a bit longer than even some people expect. And I completely agree. Very high on the hire. Love the work Lincoln Riley did in the transfer portal. Whenever I did my top transfer portal acquisitions of the entire offseason, 2 USC players made my top 5.
Yep.
Caleb Williams. And then how could you leave out Addison, who's a Bolitnikoff winner, right? Like, he won the most prestigious award for his position. He's obviously got to be on the list, but winning is hard. And I don't think that there's a general appreciation in college football for just how difficult winning is.
There is not. There most definitely is not. On a widespread, general, casual fan basis, there is not an appreciation for how hard it is to win. You need so many things to go your way.
I talk about this all the time whenever I talk about a Notre Dame, or even when I've been talking about Oklahoma in the past with Lincoln Riley. I would say something about them, and the answer I'd always get is, oh, but when they get to the college football playoffs, they lose. And my retort is consistently, but they made it. And I don't think we give enough credit for getting to the dance when there's only 4 teams. And right now, one of those teams, Alabama, seems to be a shoo-in every year. So really, any given year, you got 3 opportunities to make it. It's highly impressive just getting there. Let's focus in on Oregon real quick, because you talked about some week 1 action when it came to Utah going to Gainesville with that game, and that's going to be just a fantastic game for Utah and Florida. Georgia's in such an interesting situation to start with, right? Because if I'm looking at what the best game of week 1 is, I think the answer is probably that Ohio State Notre Dame game, just because you have a top 5 matchup. But from a storyline perspective, this Georgia-Oregon game is right up there because you have Dan Lanning going up against Kirby Smart. What's the feeling around this game right now?
The hope is that Oregon competes, that they don't come in and have, you know, a repeat of USC taking on Alabama in a similar circumstance in, I think it was 2016, 18, whatever it was. And it was, you know, 52-3 or whatever it was. That's what you have to avoid here if you're Oregon. I don't expect the Ducks to win this game. I think it's even less likely than a year ago when they went and upset Ohio State. That kind of ended up being a perfect storm. The philosophies of how those two teams went about winning football games favored Oregon in a big way because the Ducks were able to run the ball extensively on that Ohio State defense, right? They had a defensive coordinator there, I forget his name, who ended up being fired later because he did such a poor job, and that game was one of those reasons. You're not going to have that here at Georgia, right? They're missing their defensive coordinator from a year ago because he now rocks the green and yellow on a daily basis, but they still have Kirby Smart, who comes from the defensive side of the ball. So you're not going to be able to run for, I don't even remember how many yards it was, felt like 300 against Ohio State.
It was a whole lot.
I think it was it was definitely over 200 because that's primarily how Mario Cristobal wants to win football games. And Ohio State struggled to stop the run, you know, spurred by that big touchdown run by CJ Verdell in the third quarter. That was the moment where we as Duck fans kind of looked at each other and went, okay, this could happen. This is very real. This is happening. We could win this game. you're not going to be able to win like that. And I just think it's so much tougher. The challenge of going up against a Georgia team, even one that's lost 15 players in the NFL draft, 5 first-rounders, including #1 overall pick Travion Henderson and Jordan Davis, Nakobe Dean, Lewis Cine. I mean, they're just a bunch of guys who were incredibly talented. So is it going to be as good a defense as last year? No. There will be some transition, and you won't have quite as talented a guys. You're still going to have probably the most talented defense Oregon will face all season.
Yeah.
I don't think it's particularly close, right? Utah should have a good defense. Do they have the bodies that Georgia does when you look at the recruiting for the last several years? No, nobody in the Pac-12 really does. The closest team, honestly, is Oregon. They are the only team that's recruited close to SEC teams for the last 4 or 5 years with Mario Cristobal and 1 year of Willie Taggart. The recruiting has really elevated in that sense, but even that is below where these teams are, right? Georgia is a perennial top 5 recruiting power nationally. They bring in high 4 and 5-star guys like it's nothing, right? Still at Oregon, and when the Ducks get a commit from a 5-star on either side of the ball, it's pretty big news, right? It's not unexpected. Oh my gosh, how did this happen? But it's still big news. For these schools, Georgia and Alabama, and I think Ohio State kind of falls in this category too. You get a 5-star, and you're looking at how he matches up to the other 5-stars he might have to compete with, or the high 4s. And people can, harp on recruiting all they want. No, people care about stars too much, and this, that, and the other thing. The best teams in college football recruit at a high level. They care about it for a reason. Not every 5-star or high 4-star ends up being a high round draft pick in the NFL. But a good majority of the 1st and 2nd round draft picks, who are the high impact players on Saturdays, were high 4 and 5-star guys. You can have 3 stars pop. It happens all the time. But is the hit rate there as high as when you bring in a 5-star kid and he is like that rating of being a 5-star recruit doesn't happen by accident. There are dedicated professionals who are going out and scouting these kids, and they're not handing them out like candy on Halloween. And so that's the challenge for Oregon is, can you match up in the trenches? Last year with Ohio State, they were able to, frankly, dominate in the trenches. Anthony Brown wasn't pressured a lot. They ran the ball very well. But this is a Georgia team that's going to be different. And you're in another road environment. So a lot of these guys are familiar with that. I know it's a neutral site, but like, give me a break.
Yeah.
Yeah, in Atlanta. That'd be like saying, yeah, they're playing a neutral site game in Portland. It's going to be 80% Oregon fans if it's in Portland. It's going to be 80+% Georgia fans in Atlanta, and that's fine, and that's just the way that it is. So I think that when you look at the game, it's how Oregon can match up with the physicality, because being the recruiting power and arguably the most physical team, top to bottom in the Pac-12, outside of maybe Utah from or probably definitely outside of Utah from a season ago. It's different when you go play at Georgia, not just any SEC team, but when you go and play Georgia in that environment. So I don't think Oregon gets blown out here. And if they do, I will be disappointed and concerned, because that shouldn't be the case either. I don't think Oregon is going to win, but I don't think they can get blown out. And I could sit there and say, well, it was Georgia, this, that. Like, no, you come in preseason number 11 team in the country. You've recruited at a top 10, 15 level the last few years. There's talent on that roster. You have to be able to at least make this a competitive football game. I think the spread's around 17 and a half. You got to be able to be under that if Duck fans are going to feel good about it.
I completely agree. And one thing that's positive for Oregon is, if anybody's going to have an understanding as to how to slow down that Georgia offense, Dan Lanning's probably the guy. And before we go any further into this game, I do want to turn the attention to the Georgia offense, because so much of the attention is brought upon the Georgia defense, and for good reason. Let's be honest. I mean, they're sensational. I completely agree with you. They're going to have a drop-off this year, but that drop-off's still going to net them a top 10 defense. So, like, what are we really talking about?
Dropping down from one of the best defenses we've seen in the last 20 years, statistically, to what Georgia defenses have been the previous 3 or 4 years.
Defense, like, yeah,
high-class problems, man. That's called high-class problems.
Yeah, for real, honestly. But the reason I do want to bring attention to the offense is because they have a room on that offensive side of the ball that, quite frankly, I just don't know how you slow down or even stop. And it's that tight end room where they have Washington, who's 6'8". They have Brock Bowers, who is a freshman, lit it up. And they have Gilbert, who looked like the second coming of Kyle Pitts when he was playing for LSU. Luckily for the Ducks, though, maybe, arguably, one of the most explosive linebacker duos in all the nation resides in Eugene. Noah Sewell, Justin Flo. For all my people who keep up with recruiting, I don't need to say anything more than those two names because they took the nation by storm. What's the thought on slowing down that tight end room in particular, and how do you think that the Oregon linebackers can go about affecting the game?
Well, I hope and pray Justin Flo is on the field for the entire game and the entire season.
Me as well.
We've only seen him play one game. It's really been a bummer, and there's a good chance if he's healthy this entire year, he's gone to the NFL, which would be awesome because he is an explosive, dynamic, unique athlete, even more so than Sewell at that position. Noah Sewell's been more dependable to be sure. But if you're talking about who's more physically gifted of the two, it's Justin Flo, which is not a slight to Noah Sewell, but Flo is a freak athlete and then some. Sewell flies around like a heat-seeking missile. He is tough. He is big. Flo, I think, has a little more athleticism, and sadly, we just haven't gotten to see it. And I think you'll see them match up maybe in zone coverage from time to time. But what I'm looking for in this game is which of those hybrid safety linebacker players are going to be guarding the tight ends most often. Names to look for in this game on Oregon side, I think there's three primarily. Jeffrey Bassa, number one. Jamal Hill, number two, Bennett Williams, number three. Williams was a guy who a year ago was playing some safety, but he's a bigger bodied safety, and so is Jamal Hill. Jamal is even bigger than Bennett, I believe, and plays like it as well. But those are guys that in a Dan Lanning defense that a year ago at Georgia was a 4-2-5, meaning you have five DBs on the field in your base personnel. And when that's the case, typically what you have, Oregon ran that in 2019 as well with Andy Avalos, who is now Boise State's head coach. The guy who was playing kind of as that box roaming kind of star safety,
Yeah.
just kind of like a
That nickel star, depending on the terminology.
nickel. They call it a star position. Essentially, he's neither a linebacker nor a defensive back. He's something in between, and all three of those guys can play that position. And I think that that's the ideal slot to have someone match up with one of these great tight ends. Is it going to be easy? No, it most certainly is not. And I think it'll be a rude introduction for Justin Flo because the one game he played a year ago before he unfortunately got hurt was against Fresno State, and they did not have the talent on that roster that Georgia is going to have. So his first full game potentially, because I believe he didn't finish that one, he came out of it, and he was dominant in that game, had like 14 tackles or so, is going to be against probably the best tight end room in the country, and he doesn't have a ton of experience in pass coverage. Now, Oregon has good tight ends themselves, not on Georgia's level, but the tight end room is one of my favorites on this team going into 2022. So he's getting reps against some good guys who could be NFL caliber players, but he's going to have to learn to cover really fast against guys who I know are NFL caliber players. And I think that Bassa is a really dynamic athlete who can make plays in space, played linebacker. He's listed that again this year, but is small enough and nimble enough to play safety. I think he's a big safety or a small outside linebacker. It reminds me a little bit of Jamal Adams from back in the day, now with the Seahawks, my beloved, going to be terrible. Let's not talk about the Seahawks. It's just going to be terrible. But those are the three guys that are going to have to step up, because I think if you're telling me it's man-to-man on 3rd down and 7 and they've got a tight end or two on the field,
God
I
forbid
think
three.
I think you're going to be looking at maybe Sewell, but probably Flo as the more likely of the two to be in pass coverage. Sewell, that's the biggest area where he's got to grow his game, is pass coverage. He's just incredible against the run and playing sideline to sideline. But pass coverage, he's not bad, but it's not nearly where he is at the run defense level. But I think in those 3rd down situations, look for when Jamal Hill, number, I believe, 19, Bennett Williams, 15, Bassa a year ago was 33. You might have to double check the numbers, but those are the names that are going to match up with those tight ends and try and take them away as passing options for Stetson Bennett.
Yeah, and that's going to be so big for Georgia. If I had to imagine, I think we know Georgia's going to come out, depend on the run. They're very pro style, and they just have the tight end, so why wouldn't you use it? And I have no doubt they're going to have wide receivers that have ability. It's just they might not have the experience there at that position this year like they had last year after some transfer portal losses, some NFL losses. So now let's move it to up front on this defensive side for the Ducks. How is Oregon going to try and get to Stetson Bennett to try and throw him off of his game?
That is a $1 million question. Probably the biggest weakness I've got for the Ducks defense going into this year is pass rush. Interior defensive line, they're solid. A couple guys last year, Brandon Dorlus and Popo Almavai. Dorlus, better NFL prospects than Popo, but they were the two highest graded interior defensive linemen according to Pro Football Focus in 2021. Now it's a different battle and it's a different level when you're going up against an SEC offensive line. They brought in a couple transfers as well, Jordan Riley and Casey Rogers from Nebraska and Sam Taimani down from Washington. How those guys match up will be determinant of how effective Sewell and Flo are allowed to be against the Georgia rushing attack. But the pass rush, which typically comes off the edge, you can from time to time get pressure up the middle. Dorlus has done it more than a few times in his career, but the edge players are going to have to step up in a big way. DJ Johnson, Braden Swinson, Mace Funa, maybe Trevin Maai a little bit. Like these are guys who have to be able to win some one-on-ones, not entirely. You know, you don't have to blow by the way Kayvon Thibodeau did last year to just get a sack and, disrupt the drive and stop it in its tracks entirely. But they've got to be able to just create some quarterback pressures. And I'm really worried about that because last year when Kayvon Thibodeau was not on the field, every game, right? He got suspended for a BS targeting call or for the first half of the Cal game because the targeting call was at the end of the Stanford game. That first half, Chase Garbers last year at Autzen Stadium, right, for Cal, had a good amount of time to throw. And the Cal offense was doing enough to keep themselves in that game. Kayvon Thibodeau came into that game. Boom. He was wrecking plays left and right and making life really difficult and getting constant pressure. But nobody else was consistently able to get pressure off the edge. And DJ Johnson looked like a man possessed in Oregon spring game this year. And I'm hoping that we see that version of him and he kind of realizes his potential because he's a guy who's played both sides of the ball in the 4 years he's been with the Ducks out of necessity from attrition and injuries. He's had to play tight end, and now he is strictly on the defensive side. And he's got to be one of Oregon's best pass rushers. I think he's the most physically gifted guy that's there. He has an NFL body, just hasn't had the NFL level production to this point. And there would be no better time for him to have a welcoming party to the 2022 season than in this Georgia game because is probably my biggest area of concern. The safeties as well, a lot of question marks there. But if you give Stetson Bennett a bunch of time to throw, I think we know he's not a Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, but he's a national championship winning one.
Yeah, and he doesn't make mistakes a lot of the time,
No,
right?
no.
Like
Yeah. You got to force him into his mistakes because he's not going to be. He doesn't have that sort of gunslinger mentality because he's got a defensive head coach who's probably been preaching over the last couple of years as he's been playing that. Look, we just need you to be solid, make some plays, make a couple throws, take a shot every now and then, but just go out there and execute and don't lose us the game. And when that's the case, and that's what I've seen with Stetson Bennett, is he's a tremendously poised and heady individual at the quarterback position. You have to be able to force him into mistakes or force him to just throw the ball away or make a bad decision because he's not going to do any of those sorts of things on his own. And that's got to come from the edge. And I just do not have a lot of confidence in Oregon's pass rush at the edge positions this year. And I really hope I'm wrong or the defense could have a tough time.
Well, I'm sure Dan Lanning would welcome any pass rush he could get against his old head coach. But with all the talk about quarterback, let's flip it, right? Let's talk about Oregon's offense matched up with this vaunted Georgia defense. And I think there's no better way to start it than that quarterback position because you have Bo Nix, Ty Thompson, largely the two names that from the outside looking in, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like it's down to those two individuals. What's kind of the thought there?
It's down to
Oh,
one individual. It
is it
has
already
not
been
been
announced?
named. No. So that's the fascinating thing. There has been a shockingly, I believe it already has a gate name to it. I think it's like Depth Chart Gate or something like
Oh,
that.
okay.
Oregon, yeah. Oh yeah,
Okay.
it's getting there amongst the Oregon fans online. We have gotten an incredibly low amount of information. Dan Lanning has been mum's the word. I'm not telling you anything. ahead of the Georgia game with regards to who's starting at any position. Now, we as people who, myself and some other show hosts who either cover the team or follow it very closely, have theories and prognostications about who's going to be starting where. And I could, with confidence, give you a good number of the starters. There is no position I am more confident in, other than center with Alex Forsyth, than Bo Nix being the starting quarterback. It's not going to be Ty Thompson. I just don't see it. It was clear to me in the spring game that Bo is the best quarterback. He's the most experienced. Ty Thompson hasn't started a game. The limited action we've seen from him, he has not looked prepared to be a starting quarterback yet. And I just can't see how in one summer, I mean, even in Oregon spring game, he did not look prepared to be a starting quarterback. And I don't see how he could make those leaps past a guy who has started and won games for 3 years in the SEC. I know everyone wants to hate on Bo Nix because he's the worst quarterback on planet Earth. He's not the best, but he's so far from the worst. But, he's a guy who's been in environments like that, knows what it means to play in those games, knows what it's like to feel all the emotions and adrenaline of a game like that. You don't just toss Ty Thompson into the ring when he's clearly not ready. This is going to be Bo Nix coming out there as a starter.
Yeah, that's super intriguing because Ty Thompson was someone I love recruiting, right? I follow it
Oh
very,
yeah,
very
I'm huge.
closely.
Yep,
And
me too.
I was so excited for Ty Thompson whenever he went to Oregon as to what the future could hold there. And so I've been really excited to see whenever he gets his chance. I'm going to be very interested to see what he does because his upside is there. So hopefully that all comes together. So as far as the
Hold on,
offense,
can I give you a real quick semi prediction?
absolutely, please do.
Barring an injury, there is a real chance that Ty Thompson never starts a game at the University
Oh,
of Oregon.
oh,
That
that hurts
is
to hear.
that is I look, it's impossible to know the future for certain, but I'm saying right now that is a very real possibility because, as you probably know, who's coming in that 2023 cycle? It's
A
Dante Moore,
dude, a dude.
an absolute dude in Dante Moore, who everyone gets higher and higher on in the recruiting world, seemingly by the week. And if Ty Thompson, he's not going to be a starter this year, and if he's not going into next year, if he loses that job, I could 100% see him leaving that program without ever having started a game. I'm not guaranteeing that happens because if Bo Nix gets hurt, it could be Ty Thompson as the next guy up. But I'm just saying that is a real possibility.
Yeah, and while we have Dante Moore on the forefront of our minds, this is a guy who went to the Elite 11, and that MVP race, from everything I've been told, he and Jackson Arnold did nothing but impress every person there from opening day till end day. So super excited for Dante Moore. But I also want to talk about this offensive line because an offensive lineman battle was won when Dan Lanning first got there for an offensive tackle who for the second year in a row was the number one player in the state of Washington to take their recruiting battle past National Signing Day in Josh Connerly Jr. One of my favorite prospects from that class, a huge win because it looked like during the final stretch, USC could be a team to watch for that battle. Ultimately, Oregon gets a huge win. What are you hearing about the offensive line and then particularly about Connerly Jr.?
The offensive line is the unit I'm most confident in going into this 2022 season for the Ducks. Really, the only one that I have no questions about outside of maybe the linebacker. I think those are the only two because you got Sewell and Flo, and you got Bossa there as well to kind of back them up, and some other talented players down on the depth chart. But the offensive line is what carried Oregon to 10 wins in 2022, and it's what will carry them to an 8 to 10 win season, depending on how things play out or rather in 2021. In 2022, the offensive line is going to be the strength of this team. And Connerly is a guy who could very well see action early, but I'd say it's more likely that he's the first guy off the bench, so to speak, to go in if there's an injury because you just have such a talented offensive line. Alex Forsyth and TJ Bass, that's your center and probably left tackle, I believe, is where Bass tends to play, which is what Connerly projects as too. I think Bass is more comfortable at guard. I could have that. I could be remembering that wrong. But anyway, those are two preseason first team All Pac-12 performers. Then you have Stephen Jones, who is a huge NFL type body. And then Big Saul and Ryan Walk are probably going to be in the offensive line. And, there's some other talented recruits at that position group. But Right now, I think Connerly's probably number 6. I won't be surprised if he gets out there soon. You could play him probably at left or right tackle, but I think he's, after this season, your left tackle of the future. But maybe he plays it right if Big Sala gets hurt and somebody's got to step in there. The reports in fall camp are that he's been getting opportunities because some offensive linemen have been dinged up a bit, and that's been good for him to get those reps and show what he can do. And so far, all indications are he's what we expect him to be, which is a guy who is going to be an offensive lineman that starts for several years and is probably an NFL draft pick too, because he's just such a good athlete, played basketball in high school. Might need to put on just a little bit of weight, comes in at like the 285 range, but his athleticism and quickness and versatility in that sense, not positional versatility. He's built like a tackle, but he's built like a modern day tackle who can have really good footwork because he's so nimble in that sense. I won't be surprised if he's playing early, but if I had to pick Oregon's starting 5 offensive linemen right now, I don't think he would be in them. But that's a testament to how talented this group is, rather than to Connerly not being the prospect he's been hyped up to be.
And that's always best case scenario. One thing I consistently talk about with offensive linemen, no matter if you're a 5-star or a 3-star, the difference in size, speed, strength, technique to be successful at the next level, it's just such a massive gap for every position, but especially that offensive line. You could be going up against an edge that's been in a system for 4 years and you're 18 years old. Like, that guy is a grown man across from you. It's different in those trenches. As we're kind of closing out here, I kind of wanted to not only get your take on the skill positions for the Oregon Ducks, but also just kind of gauge the temperature of Oregon fans heading into the season with a new head coach, new regime, and all that.
I'll start with the skill positions. Talented, a lot of new faces, unproven. There are a couple of returners from last year on the perimeter for the wide receivers. Dante Thornton and Troy Franklin started to come on more as the year went on. Franklin was a regular contributor throughout this season, but Thornton a little bit more as the season went on. Those are, I believe, the 2 highest rated wide receiver recruits outside of Cameron Colvin from like the class of 2006 that Oregon's had in the history of the program. Both high 4 stars on the 24/7 composite ranking. They're nicknamed the Skinnies because they are both pretty skinny, but they're also both very talented and can do a lot of really good things. Chris Hudson and Seven McGee are probably going to be your slot guys. McGee is a former running back who's transitioning to wide receiver, has explosive speed and athleticism, was a regular contributor a season ago. I think you're really good in the slot position if you got those 2 guys there. And then you bring in a couple experienced transfers in Caleb Chapman from Texas A&M, Chase Cota from UCLA, whose dad played at Oregon back in the 90s. Chad Cota, he was a safety, and Chase, had a solid career at UCLA for 4 years with Chip Kelly, but wanted a little bit more in terms of his role, and I think he could definitely have that this year because of the unproven nature of this wide receiver room. There's no clear cut number 1 guy. If you told me right now Dante Thornton's the top receiver at the end of the year, I'd believe you. If you told me it was Chris Hudson, I'd believe you. If you told me it was Chase Cota, I could see that too. It's all possible. They've got a super talented tight end room. Unfortunately, the Ducks did have a tragedy this offseason and the passing of Spencer Webb, so he's no longer a part of that tight end room physically, of course, because mentally he's with them every day at practice. But there are still a lot of guys in that room who I like. Terence Ferguson is my number 1 tight end for the Ducks. Maliki Matavau is a little bit more of a blocker, but can catch some passes too. Ferguson's a guy who I think that's an NFL body. He played a lot of wide receiver in college and has made the transition very well. But then you have Patrick Herbert, Justin's brother, who was a high 4-star coming out of high school, and Cam McCormick, who's battled injuries. So, still plenty of depth there, even though they unfortunately lost Spencer Webb. And, the expectations, to get to your second question about Dan Lanning and the new staff, it depends on who you ask. The interesting thing about having a new coach right now for the Ducks is you got to win right now. The over under for this team, according to Bet Online, in 2022 is 8.5. If you're Dan Lanning, you should be over that in year 1, right? I don't think there's any way to see it other than if you go 8-4 in the regular season, you better win that bowl game and put up a 9 in the win department, or questions will start to get asked. Right now, I'm a fan of giving coaches time and not demanding instant success, but this is an Oregon roster that this year, even with some notable losses in Kayvon Thibodeau, Verone McKinley, first team All-American performers in 2021, is built to win now. You've got a steady offensive line that, beyond the Georgia game, is going to be probably the best unit in almost every game that they play this year. That's just a reality. They were that way a season ago, and they should be that way again in 2022. You've got a veteran quarterback in Bo Nix who's gotten better statistically each year he's been in college, and now is playing against inferior defenses, again, after the Georgia game, from what he's accustomed to. And he's got plenty of talent around him. One quote that Mario Cristobal had when he left to take the job at Miami is, the cupboards are not bare at Oregon. And he's right. He is right. You look up and down, it's, the occasional 5-star, but it's a lot of high 3 and mostly 4-star guys everywhere you look at every position group. And there are not a lot of football programs that can say that. And there were just some schematic things that caused Oregon to not hit its ceiling in 2021. And look, there will be growing pains for Dan Lanning and the staff. That has to be an expectation if you're an Oregon fan. But at the same time, it's reasonable to expect that this team should get back to the Pac-12 championship. Whether or not they can win it, that's a little too soon to predict. I think Utah repeats, but we could feel completely different about every team basically by the end of the year, because so much can happen. And I think that when you look at the schedule that Oregon has in conference play, I think if you're Dan Lanning, you got to get back to that conference championship game because it's very doable. They, in a 9-game conference schedule, have 5 home games and 4 road games. And their 2 toughest conference games this year, UCLA and Utah, both come at home. And they're 4 conference road games. Arizona, who was 1-11 in 2021 and is rebuilding. Colorado, who you've only lost to, I think, once since they joined the Pac-12, once, maybe twice. Oregon State, who you should be better than on a yearly basis. Now, the Beavs are never going to be an easy team to beat in a rivalry like that, but still, you should be able to do it. And then the other one is Washington State, that is probably their toughest road game, and it's early in the year, right after BYU. It's their Pac-12 conference opener. So as far as a road conference schedule goes, that's about as favorable as it gets. You don't have to go at UCLA. You don't have to go at USC. You don't have to go at Utah again. If your toughest road environment is Colorado, because I think they have a little bit louder of a stadium than, say, Washington State or Oregon State, and your toughest road team is Washington State, you have to be able to take advantage of that. I expect the Ducks to be able to do it, but you got to win at least 9 games this year if you're Dan Lanning, and they should be in double digits.
Yeah, I think that's completely realistic when you look around the pack. I do love what Utah brings to the table. Big fan of Kyle Whittingham because
Huge.
you just know whenever you're playing Utah, at the very least, you're playing a very disciplined team, right? Like
Yes.
they're not going to give you the game. You have got to take it. I have a tremendous amount of respect. It's almost similar to, kind of derailing the conversation, but Pat Fitzgerald with Northwestern, right? Like no matter how talented that team is, they're going to be disciplined. They're going to play a good brand of football. Now, kind of one of the things that I think is so intriguing as we're closing this out, you talk about all of these games within the pack, right? What does the future look like? We talk so much about this year, but there is some uncertainty. And I know that there's the conference realignment talk, and I don't want to go super deep into that, but there's just kind of all of these questions as to what the future could hold for Oregon. So I kind of did want to end on that.
Well, it was made public a couple of weeks ago from a report that came out, I believe, at the Action Network, that Oregon wants to go to the Big Ten. And that had been, kind of reported and speculated on previously. They want to go to the Big Ten. If the Big Ten decides, yeah, we're going to add Oregon and Washington, the Ducks are going to bolt. There's no question in my mind about that. And it's, all been but confirmed by the University of Oregon. I don't think they've, come out and made a statement. We are looking to leave the Pac-12. They're not trying to
Naturally.
they're not trying to screw George Kliavkoff that hard. But if another conference offer comes around, whether it's the Big Ten or the Big 12, I think Oregon would leave. I think they would think more about the Big 12 without Oklahoma and Texas in it than they would the Big Ten, because that would be a no-brainer. But wherever Oregon ends up, look, I think the whole conference realignment talk, it's fascinating. Every time you go down one branch, you realize there are 5 other ones to talk about in potential scenarios. It's
Never ending rabbit hole.
it's compelling. I'm not going to stop talking about it. But at the same time, I can do that and also fundamentally hate it. Like, I didn't want the Pac-12 to change. I was fine how it was before. I'm not a huge fan of change, generally speaking, in my personal life. It's a running joke in my family that we don't like anything to change. There are very few instances where I'm okay with it, and this wasn't one of them. I saw it and I was like, dude, that's a bummer because I've grown up with these teams and these matchups. I don't want it to go away. And look, am I always going to root for Oregon football? Will there always be Oregon football? Are they always going to be a program that's capable of being competitive in any conference? Yes. But does that mean I'm going to enjoy it as much? Not necessarily, because if you told me there's a year where we don't play Oregon State in the game formerly known as the Civil War, like, that sucks. That would suck. Like, I understand the national sports talk hosts who say, "Oh, who wants to play Oregon State? Who wants to do this?" You know what? I do, because I'm from the state of Oregon and I have a bunch of friends who have been lifelong friends who are Beaver fans, and we talk smack the week leading up to the game and during and after and everything, and it's fun and it's awesome. And I, as a fan of college football, which I've been my entire life, consume it as a regional product first and a national product second. I consume it as a national product and have that look at it through that lens every single year, but I consume it as a regional product first. I like winning the Pac-12. I like going to the Rose Bowl. I like beating Oregon State and Washington, all of Oregon, all the other teams that are in that conference and the history that's there. I like all that sort of stuff. It'll always be fun and new rivalries and big games. Yeah, it'll always be college football, but it won't always be college football as I've known it. And on the whole, I think at some level it sucks for some fans, and others are really, really happy with it.
Well, I think the whole perspective that I agree. I've heard national analysts say before, like, "Oh, it's not that big of a deal that this rivalry game isn't happening." But I find that
It's
to
not
be a
that big
major.
of a deal to you. It's not
I
that
find
big of a
that
deal to you because that rivalry hasn't meant a lot on the national stage. I get that, right? I understand it, but that hasn't stopped Oregon from being relevant on a national stage, or small rivalries like that haven't stopped teams from being competitive at a national level and in a college football playoff or major bowl game conference championship discussion. But to other people like that, and I'm not accusing you of being this or anything like that, Ty, but it's the epitome of what I'm talking about. The national writers or people will say like, oh, well, what's the appeal to a Stanford? Well, Stanford Cal would stay around, but Oregon State and Washington State or something, or Oregon and Oregon State, or anything like that. It's like, it doesn't have an appeal to you, but to the people in that community over there and the fans who have grown up with that game and they know the history and they remember all the matchups and the moments that have made that rivalry special, whichever one it is, that's what is being lost.
Yeah, and as I was gonna say, the whole argument that the national perspective gives to me is a fallacy because it fails to realize what separates college football from so many other sports.
Yes.
College football is inherently
Yes.
tribalism at its core,
Yes.
right? And you're
More than
now
any other
their
sport.
sport.
There are rivalry. Like, I have professional sports teams that I'm a fan of, right? There are teams that I dislike, but they're more ones that I've grown to dislike over the years. I, as a Duck fan, have had an inherent dislike and rivalry with Washington and Oregon State fans my entire life, from the time I was like 6 or 7. Okay? I'm a Mariners fan. I hate the Astros. I hate the Astros for 5 years. I've been wanting to beat the crap out of the Beavs for the last 15 or more, and I'm about to turn 25. Like, that's different. It feels different. It hits different. It ju-
Absolutely.
it's why, just as you said, it's why college football is so great. It is more tribal than the other sports.
And
Way more.
I've always been perplexed at the national analysts because as much as your point is true about it at a regional level is so important, in my opinion, even as someone who tries to look at this from a national level, it's almost even more important for the national storylines, this tribalism, for it to exist and for the importance of the tribalism to be recognized. because from that national perspective is where we as college football fans can really start selling the argument that I don't find to be an argument. I don't think you find it to be an argument, that college football is inherently the most unique sport we have, and there are tangible reasons why. In my opinion, I'm so perplexed when the national perspective looks over that, because the national perspective helps prove that argument if only you recognize the importance of this tribalistic nature of fan bases. It's always just gone over my head.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And I compare it to the NFL because it's the same sport, you know. From afar, I sense the animosity that exists when the Iron Bowl happens or when Oklahoma plays Texas. That's a rivalry I want to see. Meanwhile, in the NFL, and again, I'm a fan of the NFL. I watch it every year, like big football fan writ large. One of the big rivalries in the NFL is the Steelers and the Ravens. I have never, not once in my entire life, watched a Steelers and Ravens game and felt as drawn into it as a West Coast sports fan as I have Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, Auburn, or whichever rivalry. Heck, Bedlam, Oklahoma State last year. I have never watched an NFL game and felt that rivalry the way that those feel. It's not close to me. It doesn't mean there aren't real rivalries in professional sports. There 1000% are, but they hit at a different level and I think have a broader appeal and make college football unique because of the way that college sports work in the United States. It's why I am such a huge college football fan. It's unlike anything else in the world.
I completely agree. And my hope with conference realignment is that they see the necessity of those rivalries, and that even throughout all this chaos, those rivalries will rival. My list comes out as we're finishing this out. These rivalries will remain strong even through all the movement. That's, I think, the best case scenario. We've already heard that it looks like Oklahoma State will continue. I certainly hope that
it be better.
You and me both. You and me both.
Like I don't want to live in a world, and I actually used to live in Oklahoma. I know that the fans in that state, even the Sooner fans who are in favor of going to the
grew
SEC,
up in Gainesville, Texas, on the Red River. So yes,
I assure you that those Oklahoma and Oklahoma State fans don't want to live in a world where that doesn't exist. And look, if you can have conference realignment and keep a lot of these rivalries in place, maybe that is the best of both worlds. But I just don't want to get away from what makes college football so awesome. And that's that I want to beat the teams that are around me first and foremost.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Spencer, it has been so much fun having you on. Can't believe that it's the first time we've ever gotten to sit down and talk. It felt like we've done this perpetually. So I do live streams. If ever you want on Mondays, Fridays, you're always more than welcome. I'd love to get you on there. Mondays, we recap the week that just happened. Fridays, we give a preview to the weekend that is going to happen. So any availability you have, I'd love to get you on again. And certainly we'll have to talk again about the Oregon Ducks here soon. But before I let you go, once again, let the people know where they can find you. That way nobody's missing out on all this great Oregon Duck information.
Yeah, I'd love to be back on the show and talk with you, man. Always good to meet someone who understands the unique and specialness of college football. At Smalls_55 is the Twitter handle for those of you watching. You can see it right there, and you can hit up either of the shows I host for the Locked On Podcast Network, Locked On Ducks or Locked On Pac-12, available on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I will see you all next time because, Ty, I think we do have to indeed do this again.
I think so, man. I've had an absolute blast. I'll link all of your information down in the description so that people can find it a bit easier. But having said that, we'll see y'all later.